This time on the Plutopia podcast, Charles Herrman interviews philosopher Randall Auxier. We explore his academic career and his views on personalism. Auxier expressed his skepticism toward academia, arguing that it discourages original thinking and punishes those who refuse to conform to popular theories.
From the very beginning, I had difficulty finding teachers, and so kind of had to teach myself this stuff. And most people regard it as enormously difficult stuff. And so in a way, it was a challenge to not have a teacher, and in a way, it was a blessing, because if I had had a teacher, I might have fallen into whatever that teacher thought about this material, because that's the natural thing to do, is to pay attention to, your mentors and the people you respect. As it turned out, since I had no one to teach me this stuff, I mean, my professors were perfectly content for me to study it, but they said, we don't read this stuff. We don't know what you're talking about. And so I ended up having to sort of make it up in the sense of make up my own interpretations of these people's very difficult ideas. And that ended up being pretty good, actually, for me, because I don't think that I would have been satisfied with anyone else's version of this stuff.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, John Lebkowski. Scoop Sweeney and Wendy Grossman, the other co-hosts, are here, but today we're doing something a bit different. We're hosting an interview that we're not really conducting. Our guests are Charles Herrman, a philosopher and senior research fellow at the American Institute for Philosophical and Cultural Thought. Charles will interview Randall Auxier, a professor of philosophy and communications at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Charles will begin by telling us more about Randall's career. So take it, Charles.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Randy, for making time for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Randy obtained his PhD in philosophy from Emory in 1992 with a thesis entitled Signs and Symbols, an Analogical Theory of Metaphysical Language. I think metaphysics is probably his primary interest, though he's published in every area of the discipline. I look on him as my mentor. His first out-of-school position was that of chair of Oklahoma City University's Department of Philosophy from 1992 to 1997. And it was in 1997 that I met Randy at the Austin home of Charles Hartshorne, a long-since retired professor of philosophy at UT. I hope Randy will find it possible to mention Hartshorne at some point during the interview. Randy is the editor of the Library of Living Philosophers series, and he co-founded the Journal of the Pluralist, and more recently, he has been deputy chief editor of IDOS, an international open source journal for the philosophy of culture. Once each year since 2019, I have published in this journal. He edits a book series for the State University of New York Press, and he is co-founder and co-director of the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought in Southern Illinois. He is also co-founder of the Kasirer Center for International Scholarship and Cooperation in Poland. Randy has authored numerous books, including Time, Will, and Purpose, Living Ideas from the Philosophy of Josiah Royce, and The Quantum of Explanation, Whitehead's Radical Empiricism, written with Gary Herstein. He has taken on roles in 8 ongoing book projects, including, again with Gary Herstein, The Continuity of Possibility, Whiteheadian Exclusions Beyond the Actual. I might mention in closing that his CV is a mere 53 pages long. Needless to say, I have offered only the barest outline and had to leave out much else that was undoubtedly noteworthy. With that, I'll go ahead and begin the questions. Let me start with a 2-part question that will help to add what we should know about Randy's background. First, what specifically brought you, Randy, to philosophy as a lifelong course of study? And secondly, along the lines of PWL, philosophy as a way of life, how does your life express philosophy? And is any part of your way of life inherently philosophical?
I don't think there's any part of my life that isn't inherently philosophical. For me, philosophy is like rolling off a log. It's just so natural. But it took me quite a while to learn that because I didn't know philosophy was a thing. I didn't realize that what I had been doing, I was kind of both popular and unpopular with my teachers in school and high school and even on into college, because I had questions that were not the typical questions that their students would ask. Some teachers recognized this as being, thinking, as involving thinking. Some teachers resented it because they thought that I was questioning their authority. And that never was true until they started to behave like I was questioning their authority, at which point I did question their authority. And so, anyway, what happened was I got out of high school. I just floated naturally into the local university. I grew up in Memphis, and so the local university is it's now called the University of Memphis. Then it was called Memphis State, although all my friends called it Tiger High because that's where everybody just sort of went after. It's like this is like a small wave that went from every high school in Memphis into this university. Turns out that that university has a really remarkable philosophy department, but I didn't discover that for a while. I was a criminal justice major and thought I might be a lawyer, and then I discovered what lawyers actually do, and that wasn't interesting. And so then I sort of drifted, and then I quit school. And then I started playing music and trying to make a living as a musician. That turns out to be a very difficult way to make a living. However, I learned a lot in the course of it. But here's what actually happened. This is what led me to philosophy. I got good enough that improvising on the bass, I'm primarily a bass player, improvising on the bass was something that I learned how to do and I could do it, but I didn't understand what it was. I don't know how you really do that. And being the sort of person who thinks too much, I thought too much about how on earth is this even possible that I'm playing something I've never played before. It makes musical sense, sounds good, usually, not always. It sounds good, and my fingers are doing things that they have never done before. My body is creating rhythmic patterns that it has never created before, that I've never heard before anywhere else, and yet it never lasts more than about 30 seconds, by the way. You fall back into the stock licks that you know. But anyway, this was a question that got me in trouble and still gets me in trouble because the question is what must the universe be such that one can cooperate with it in this way? Because there's no point in saying that somehow I'm intending to play what I'm playing. There's no way. There's not time for that. You don't get time to intend it. There is a mode of anticipation involved, but the anticipation is just as mysterious as the actual playing. And so your body gets into a temporal loop in which you sort of welcome the next possibility as it comes, but you don't have time to think about it. And in fact, you don't even really have time to perceive it because it happens too fast. By the time you perceive it, it's all over. And so anyway, I found this to be, it's not exactly a mystical experience, although it must approximate that in some ways. But it's inexplicable. And so I try to talk to other musicians about it, and they go, yeah, 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 that's what it's like. But they didn't want to like figure out why. It's just like it just is. And so anyway, when I went back to school, I wouldn't exactly say I failed, but I would say I learned what it was going to take to succeed, and music ceased being fun. And so I went back to school and I took a philosophy class. And I thought, now these people might have some answers to the kinds of, because they were willing to talk in a disciplined way about the kinds of phenomena that I was describing. And so, anyway, I did end up being disappointed down the line because it turns out philosophers don't really care very much about this sort of thing. But along the way, I had a teacher who said you should go to the library and here's what you need to pick up. You need to pick up Alfred North Whitehead and Henry Bergson and John Dewey and read these books because these people are going to be talking about the kinds of things that you're interested in. And that turned out to be the case. And so I went to the library and I found John Dewey's Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, and started just reading, standing there at the shelves. And right within my at eye level was a copy of Process and Reality on the same shelf. And so those are the two books I took home to read. And things have been ever since then, it's been like that, which is I became specialists in the thought of Bergson and Whitehead and Dewey. I became specialists. Yeah, actually, plurality is the right way to go at that. And so I started studying that stuff, but it's not terribly um, popular in the United States in mainstream philosophy. And so I was swimming upstream from the very beginning because my interest in time and process and relation is out of step with the two dominant methodologies in philosophy, the analytical and the continental. Neither group is particularly interested in the things I'm interested in. So from the very beginning, I had difficulty finding teachers, and so kind of had to teach myself this stuff. And most people regard it as enormously difficult stuff. And so, in a way, it was a challenge to not have a teacher, and in a way, it was a blessing because if I had had a teacher, I might have fallen into whatever that teacher thought about this material, because that's the natural thing to do, is to pay attention to, your mentors and the people you respect. As it turned out, since I had no one to teach me this stuff, I mean, my professors were perfectly content for me to study it, but they said, we don't read this stuff. We don't know what you're talking about. And so I ended up having to sort of make it up in the sense of make up my own interpretations of these people's very difficult ideas. And that ended up being pretty good, actually, for me, because I don't think that I would have been satisfied with anyone else's version of this stuff. But along the way, of course, I did have to learn the standard readings of all of these people that I study, and to learn where I depart from those readings, to go back to the text and figure out why I depart and what was it I was seeing. Sometimes I have to correct myself. It's like, oh, they see something I didn't see. But more often than not, I think I was on the right track in general. And so I came up with essentially my own interpretations of a bunch of these difficult thinkers and have published that stuff along the way and made a career out of it. Now, as a way of life, I don't separate my work from my life at all. I pretty much live the process philosophy every day, and so that it manifests. I wouldn't know any other way to do it. I understand that some people can separate their work life from their daily life, but that would be really hard for me to do. And fortunately, I chose a path where I didn't have to do that. If I had a job I didn't like, I guess I would have to learn to do that. But for me, this isn't even work. I mean, this is like I would do this for free, and sometimes they almost make me. Uh, it's they definitely pay you as little as they can, and get as much work out of you as possible for what they do pay you. But I'm not really complaining, because to get paid to do philosophy all day every day, that's not a bad. I mean, that's good work if you can get it. And so I'm not complaining. They could pay me less and I still wouldn't complain. They could not pay me at all and I might not complain, but my wife would. Um, so anyway, this is it's so natural to me, Charlie, that it's not even like work at all. Philosophy is my way of life, but I realized that that was true even before I studied it. It's a certain temper of mind that some people have. It's like poets in a way. Some people just born to bring primary experience to words. I'm not one of those people, but some people are just sort of born to take the secondary aspect of experience as the primary point of interest. And when I say secondary, what I mean is you have the experience and then you reflect on or you think about the experience. And if you like that second part better than the first part, then you might end up studying philosophy.
Well, your publishing history obviously includes Alfred North Whitehead, as we just found out. It also includes personalism, but I would start, in fact, with Charles Sanders Peirce, who is very possibly the greatest of all American philosophers, and I'm sure you'd probably attest to that, Randy. So most would say that the most important contribution that he made is in pragmatism, though most know very little about it, and those who do might well associate it more with William James. I wonder if you could help out the viewer and provide an overview on this.
Well, Peirce was quite a character. I do agree he's the most important, and in fact, I would say the greatest American philosopher who has lived. I would put him in the top five in the whole history of the world. But there's a reason that you haven't heard of him. You've heard of Plato and Aristotle and possibly Kant. Why haven't you heard of Peirce is a very good question. Part of it is that nobody could sabotage Peirce like Peirce. He had this. He was a polymath of the highest order, but he couldn't finish a project. And those who knew him personally knew how brilliant he was, and they kept encouraging him, would you please finish a book? He kept starting books, but he never finished one. He did manage to finish several series of articles that are of absolute permanent importance. However, he is so difficult to read and so difficult to follow that even he couldn't do it. He admitted in a letter in 1909, he lived 1839 to 1914. He admitted in a letter to Paul Carus in 1909 that he was rereading his own article from 1867 called A New List of Categories, which may be one of the 3 or 4 most important works in the history of philosophy. And he admitted he wasn't sure what he was talking about. And so this is an enormously difficult piece of writing, but it is so full of new ideas and ideas that seen from a perspective people hadn't seen before. But anyway, once you're sort of exposed to this guy, if you can sort of get in the flow of his thinking, it's pretty hard to go back. And so he became the primary source of my dissertation topic. Part of it was is there was nobody to supervise a Whitehead dissertation. Part of it was is a Whitehead dissertation wouldn't have helped me very much in getting a job. But Peirce has been growing in importance all through the 20th century, and is now at the peak of his importance. And part of it is that we're slowly beginning to catch up to his ideas. We haven't caught up to his ideas. So what are these ideas that are so far ahead of their time? Well, he was a mathematician. As well as an applied scientist, geodesics in particular, so earth measuring. He was also very adept in physics, but mostly he was the son of the most famous American mathematician of his generation. His father, Benjamin Peirce, was a Harvard mathematician and world famous. And so Charles grew up in a household with, the highest end mathematics you could possibly imagine. His writings on mathematics are still quite beyond how should I put it? You would most mathematicians can't really follow what he was doing, but they are available in 8 gigantic volumes that I can't read. Um, and I don't know anyone who can. There are some mathematicians who can read them a little bit. But anyway, what kind of mathematics? Well, it's all kinds. Relational mathematics, all kinds of mathematical ideas put on new grids and demonstrated in new ways according to new methods. He was also he was not only a first-rate logician, he's probably the greatest logician since Aristotle, and that is saying something. And so not only the math, but the logic is so creative. His more popular ideas, like pragmatism, these things came out in essays that were published during his lifetime, and even those were not followed very closely by very many people. But he had some powerful and influential friends like William James and Josiah Royce, who were interpreting these ideas to a wider public. And they would always attribute them to Peirce, but nobody bothered to go and find out, who is this guy that they're talking about. Instead, what they would do is they would take either James's or Royce's ideas from Peirce and just go down that path. Anybody who picked up Peirce's actual works was going to be discouraged in a hurry by the difficulty and the fragmentary character of them. So anyway, but he caught my attention. He caught my attention while I was still an undergraduate. And I had to read some of his popular essays in a class on pragmatism. And I thought, this guy's smarter than the rest of them. I want to read more. And so I started then, and I'm still reading more. I became a scholar of this kind of philosophy. And the Peirce scholars, they don't interact very much with anybody else, because if you have sort of devoted yourself to Peirce, you don't have time for anything else. And so there's a world of scholars out there who just read Peirce, and they're all over the world. They're in China, they're in Europe, they're in South America, they're here. Peirce is popular here, unlike Whitehead. Peirce is popular in the United States, and if you're a Peirce scholar, you can get yourself a job. And maybe that's how I got mine.
Thank you, Randy. That was fascinating. I think we can agree, at least I certainly agree, and I think you do too, that Alfred North Whitehead's greatest gift to posterity is related to his modeling of the universe. In my opinion, in a few powerful and fundamental processes, each with a label applicable to everything from human beings to elementary particles, he put a premium on explaining the physics of the universe. So, really, I'm just interested to know what you would add to that description. When you go abroad to speak of what you call the gospel of Whitehead, what is it that you stress?
Outside of the United States, Whitehead actually is very popular. It's in the United States that he's not, and I'm not sure exactly why that is. I could make up a story, but why bother? Um, when I go to spread the gospel of Whitehead, the one place that Whitehead is not appreciated is in his hometown, especially Boston. Now he's not from Boston; he's British, but he moved to Harvard in 1925, and he finished his career and he did his most important work while he was at Harvard. And he's buried in the United States, so therefore he must be at least an honorary American. He did take on U.S. citizenship. So is this guy an American? Well, no, because he never would have thought the way he thought if he had grown up here. But he was not accepted as a philosopher in Great Britain. And so when he came here, he was accepted as a philosopher and was able to do this amazing cosmology. Um, Cosmology essentially is the study of the order of the universe, not just the universe as a whole, but the order and the forms of order that are exemplified in the universe. And in order to study that, you have to have some kind of a method. And, the standard method for today's cosmologists is they just use mathematics to model the universe. And there's lots of different kinds of mathematics that are used. And depending on what kind of mathematics you favor, you end up with this model or that model of the universe. That's not the way Whitehead approached it. He was a mathematician of the highest order, not as high as Peirce, but and he was a logician of the highest order, but not as high as Peirce. However, as a cosmologist, Whitehead probably significantly surpassed Peirce, because Whitehead had the ability to finish a book. Um, and if you finish Peirce's books in your mind, they might be as good as Whitehead's, but you have to do the work yourself. Whereas Whitehead was able to bring tasks to completion, and so he published many books, and these books are just filled with creative ideas about the types of order that exist in the universe and the ways that we might describe them for philosophical and scientific purposes, and also his various methods, which are basically adapted from mathematical methods, especially genetic and coordinate analysis. These methods turn out to reveal all kinds of relationships that we tend to overlook in our more ordinary descriptive ways of going at, say, culture, or going at social order, or going at Whitehead doesn't spend much time on politics. He sees politics as just one of many forms of culture. So anyway, he doesn't have a separate aesthetic theory, but he has an aesthetic theory that's a part of his cosmology. And so Whitehead tends to see the way things hang together in the largest sense of the word as the central philosophical problem. And he wants to go at that empirically, which is to say his models can't be just abstract models that might give us predictive power. They need to be concrete descriptions, whether mathematical or in narrative, that give us genuine insight into the ways that things unfold, the way that time unfolds, the way that order unfolds, and the ways in which it's found. So that in a nutshell is what Whitehead was up to. And he was peculiarly good at it, but his works are so difficult to read because he was sort of poetic in his philosophical language. He created a language that you have to learn his language in order to understand his ideas, and a lot of people aren't willing to learn his language. It's just too difficult. It takes too much time. It takes decades to learn how to read this guy, and so you can hardly blame people for not. They take one look at it and they say, "I'll never understand this." To which I say when I'm teaching it to students, to which I say, well, you can. You can understand this, but it's going to require a lot of effort, and you're going to have to unlearn a lot of what you thought you knew in the process of learning how to understand this guy's ideas.
Wow, thank you, Randy. That was a fantastic overview. Thank you so much. Now let me go to your Wikipedia page. There you have mentioned on your behalf process personalism. And this is going to go back to Whitehead, of course, but I just want to mention that it's one of the areas that you're credited as being best known for. So my question is, what is process personalism? And was Charles Hartshorne a personalist?
Yeah, so there are lots of different kinds of personalists. Most personalists are pretty hardcore theists of some sort or another, especially, for example, in the present, the followers of Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, are these. There is a kind of personalism that he not only defended, but he was an original sort of personalist philosopher. He had ideas about act and person that are peculiar to him. Once he became pope, you didn't see very much of that anymore because a pope isn't really allowed to philosophize. Um, they have to they have to speak the doctrine of the church. And once that happened, once Wojtyła became John Paul II, he was speaking for the church, not as much for himself. And so most of this really interesting stuff came before he became pope. But that said, that is the dominant strain of personalism that's out there right now. But there are many others, and I don't really belong to that group because it's Thomistic phenomenological personalism, and I'm neither a phenomenologist nor a follower of Aquinas. And so this stuff is the ontology is quite remote from me. Process personalism, on the other hand, treats the idea of person as a relational idea that unfolds in time and that gives both value and dignity to any process. So when you talk about the sort of value that's generated in the unfolding of a process, that's what I mean by person. Whatever value, cosmological value is generated. And that means person is pretty much everywhere. It's just variably, concentrated or localized in processes like you and me. But it's concentrated in processes like my cat and that tree out there. And for all I know, the rocks. There's no reason to suggest that anything that exists is devoid of value in the cosmological sense of value. Everything that exists gets some value from its existing. That's a quote from Whitehead. And so if that's the case, then person is a matter of degree and intensity, to use Whitehead's term. It's a matter of the localization and intensity of the process that's unfolding. And the most intensive processes are the ones that are also most obviously or most evidently personal processes. So where person occurs, some intensity and depth of becoming are evident, and where it occurs in a frankly unsustainable but incredibly intense way, like biological life, in situations like that, we have person in a higher sense. So a process personalist is a person who's going to see person as a process and not as a destination, not as an end, not as the outcome of evolution. It's a transitional thing in which, for a time, we find the localization of energies in the personal form in their depth and intensity such that it's hard to miss them. And so with human beings, it's pretty hard to miss personality as one of the excrescences, if you want to, of the process of person. I would say our personalities are residual of this process. The process is always running ahead of anything that we could identify as personality. But personality is something that is exuded ex post facto by the process of person.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on that, why not Aquinas?
The ontology is so I like Aquinas, but I don't like Thomists very much. If I were allowed to read Aquinas the way I want to read him, I'm not sure I would have any disagreements with him. But unfortunately, I'm required to read him within a historical context of not the Christianity that he's talking about, but the Christianity that came to be, partly as a result of his thought. And so I find that kind of Christianity much too limiting, even when reading Aquinas. So if we could sit down and read the Summa together, and if I could tell you what I see, I think it would end up looking a lot like process personalism. But the Thomists are just not okay with this. They want the human person to be a sort of ultimate end of God's intent or purpose for the world or for the universe. The Thomists are very, very careful thinkers, and anytime you raise an objection, they can meet it with some kind of a distinction. But I don't think they're going to be able to answer the objections I have, which is basically if you take one step, just one little step back from Orthodox Christianity and let this guy speak, you'll realize that what he's talking about includes Orthodox Christianity and much more.
I see. Thank you for that. And I had asked you if you thought Hartshorne was a personalist. I'll give you a little story about Hartshorne from my personal perspective, since I was happily a guest of his for the summer of 1997. I asked him if he was a personalist straight out.
Mm-hmm.
And he was glum to the idea. He didn't take much to it.
Mm.
And I asked him why, and he didn't really have an answer. But I think he was a personalist based on his work. And I think he would agree with that as well.
Well, I asked him the same question, and he said he was, but it was 1993, so maybe in the 4 years between. I doubt it, though. Um, when you would, it depended on his mood by the time he was that age, and it would also depend on what he thought the person who was asking the question was trying to get at. In my case, because he and I had talked about a lot about his friend, Edgar Sheffield Brightman. And the reason we were talking about them is I was in the process of editing this book, The Hartshorne Brightman Correspondence. I got interested in Brightman because he's probably the second most important Boston University personalist, and he had a lot of really interesting process. He was influenced by both Whitehead and Heidegger, and so unlike the earlier important Boston University personalist Borden Parker Bound, Brightman was incorporating process personalism into the development of personalist ideas, and in particular including Whitehead. So anyway, Hartshorne and Brightman were friends, and Brightman was the older man by a good bit, and so he was a bit of a mentor to Hartshorne. And so I had been studying Brightman, and when I first met Hartshorne, I said, "So you knew Brightman?" And he said, "Oh yeah, you could have a great argument with Brightman." And so the question I would put to him is, well, tell me about Brightman. Tell me about your arguments with Brightman. And Hartshorne was actually very excited about having that discussion. And it was after that that I said, "Well, are you a personalist?" He said, "Oh yeah." So anyway, and he says so in here. So I mean, there's no question that Hartshorne regarded himself as a personalist for most of his career. What kind of a personalist? Well, it's interesting because he created a view called neoclassical theism, which stands in contrast to Thomism. It stands in contrast to the traditional sort of Aquinas nexus of Christian interpretation. It is much closer to St. Augustine. And there have always been powerful Catholic thinkers who were closer to Augustine than to Aquinas. But Hartshorne had quite a few problems with Aquinas. And as a result of that, he ended up reconstructing a kind of theism that's closer to Augustine, and he called it the neoclassical view. Now, if you take that view and ask the question of person, well, Augustine is a personalist in a much more obvious and easier sense than Thomas is. St. Thomas, I mean. And part of the reason is that Thomas has this this one main view that really makes it difficult to see him as a personalist, and that is that God is externally related to the world, but the world is internally related to God, which is to say that God is unchanged by what happens in the world, but the world is changed by the way it relates to the divine. And so that view, which is an asymmetry of relatedness, prevents God from being a person. Uh, any being that cannot respond in an internal relation to change in another being cannot be a person. And so only persons are capable of that kind of mutual immanence is what Hartshorne calls it. God is immanent in me, but I'm not immanent in God, according to Aquinas. Hartshorne just thought this was so mistaken because he said it renders God less than human instead of superhuman, to be unable to be affected by what happens to us. It also means God can't answer prayer, and it means, I mean, there's just a whole list of things that go by the wayside if you insist upon this idea that the world does not change God. And so the Thomists insist on that, and then they do what's called casuistry, which is they try to get God off the hook for not being affected by or changed by the world. And process philosophers don't have much patience with this kind of casuistry. And so the process God, the neoclassical God, the God that Hartshorne argues for, is not only the past of God is not changed by the world, but the present of God is. And so his sort of brilliant insight is the difference between existence and actuality. The existence of God is not changed by the world, but the actuality of God is actually more changed by the world than any other being. He calls it the concrete God or the surrelative God. So this is a big idea. I was impressed, to say the least. It's a big idea. Nobody else before that had exactly this way of working it out. And so that God could be a person. The surrelative God could be a person, could be a personal being. Now, Hartshorne wasn't much of he didn't care much for Protestant or any kind of Christian orthodoxy. His ideas about God didn't have anything to do with Jesus or incarnation or anything of the kind. But he thought that the surrelative God or the concrete God was a personal being, and in fact, more personal than we are. So anyway, he was a personalist through and through. You must have caught him when he was suspicious of why you were asking him the question. I mean, if you just walked up to him and said, "Are you a personalist?" If you just walked up to me and said that, I would go, "Well, what do you mean?" Because if you think that what I mean by being a personalist is that somehow persons are the only or the most, and especially human persons, are the most important thing in the universe, then no, that's not what I mean. I do think that anything that's important has some personal character to it. But that's a depth and intensity and capacity for the accumulation of value. It doesn't have anything to do with personality necessarily, although I would say you can find personality anywhere that person is unfolding. So even this rock being configured the way it is, there's some personality in that, in the sense that it's not like any other rock, and therefore sort of uniquifies itself before the cosmos as just this rock and not some other rock. If you want to call that personality, I'd say, well, that's not too big a distortion.
Well, I'm glad I raised that point. That's very interesting, and I am educated because of that. As a follow-up on personalism, I'd like to know why it seems to me that the study of persons is not too popular in academia and almost unknown as a discipline to anybody outside of academia. And I almost wonder whether novelists and philosophers discussing from various vantages what persons are is more than what constitutes personalism. What more, if anything, should be necessary? I have always thought maybe a personalist ethics.
Well, there's plenty of personalist ethics. I mean, it's all over the place in the sense that everything from law to politics are worried about what counts as a person and what doesn't count as a person. I mean, this is one of the most fraught issues everywhere at every time in human history is, what counts and what doesn't count. And when you're talking about what counts, you almost always mean something like person. You could humanize it in the sense that you could say that, well, only humans count because only humans are persons. Now we have to figure out what counts as a human. If you wanted to do it that way, you could, but I would say that's backwards. Because it's pretty clear that most humans are persons, if not all, just as a matter of common sense. And so, since most humans are persons, the question is actually what else is a person? What else should be included? And my favorite answer to that question is Royce's answer, which is the community. The community is a person, and it's a person in a more concrete and temporally extended sense than any human individual. Communities are what we actually create together, and they have the capacity to outlast us and to carry forward all that is most intensely valuable to us. And so, therefore, if you want to be utterly sincere about what a person is, the community is a person in the first instance. And we, as human individuals, are personalized by the community. And insofar as we are persons, we are made that way by our communities. And so I would say, in the first instance, at least as an ethical question, communities are the most important persons, and they're also the most concrete persons, which is to say, their capacity to replicate their form of order, sustain it, intensify it, build it, accumulate it, and pass it on, exceeds the power of any human individual.
Are you
And
comfortable including corporations as persons?
I am, but they're sociopathic persons.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I've written about this. I mean, to me, the Citizens United decision is disastrous precisely because it confuses sociopathic personhood with personhood as such, or political personhood. And so the trouble is that you've got people going around saying corporations aren't persons. Yes, they are. They're just not good persons. They should be held accountable in the way we would hold individual human persons accountable. They're not even held accountable in the way that we would hold communities accountable for their behavior. I mean, take an organic community of people who live together. They all misbehave together. The community, I mean, so make it a football team or something. They don't get to go to the bowl game, and here's a fine for you, right? Not getting to go to the bowl game is probably more important as a punishment than any amount of money they might pay. But the only way we hold corporations responsible is by fining them. You can give a corporation the death penalty. Enron got the death penalty as a corporation, but this I would say is an option not often enough exercised. I would say breaking up corporations using anti-monopoly legislation is another form of the death penalty for sociopathic corporations. And in fact, the whole process by which we decide whether predatory behavior is something a corporation has engaged in, that whole process is very much like a process we would apply to a human person in trying to decide whether that person is deserving of some kind of confinement or sequestration. And so we can sequester a corporation. And so I would say we do have some legal tools and some legal ideas that enable us to hold corporations responsible for anti-personal behavior. But do we do this often enough? No, we don't. The idea of the corporation, when it first came up in the Grant administration in the 1870s, was a good idea because corporations were supposed to operate only and solely for the public benefit. And if they do, they would be important communities of persons or community persons. But anyway, yes, corporations and when they work, they're persons and they're not sociopathic. But when they don't work, which is unfortunately the norm, when they are so greedy that the only thing they're interested in is the bottom line, they forgot that their charters depend upon service to the public. When corporations behave that way, sure, they're still persons, they're just not good persons. They're behaving exactly the way our oligarchs are behaving right at the moment. So,
Charlie
Thank you
Strauss.
very much for that question, Wendy. I appreciate that. Were you about ready to say something else?
Well, I was just going to say, I thought it would amuse Randy to know that Charlie Strauss has said that the corporations are old, slow AIs. he was talking about Nick Bostrom's thing about paperclip maximalization, and corporations behave exactly like that.
There's a nice analogy there.
Well, thank you, Randy, for that explanation. And I especially appreciate your bringing up Royce and the concept of the community as a person. I'm sure that the folks on the other end of the line are wondering about that and thinking about it. So thank you again for that. Now, speaking finally of persons in a different sense, mainly the sense of individualism, what in particular are the harms associated with individualism? I know you're not very keen on that idea.
Well, individualism means taking something that the community has done for you and acting it as if you did it for yourself. It's a pathology of community. Individualism has contributed nothing of value to Western history and has contributed much damage. Individualism is an ideology that is essentially ahistorical and anti-social. And so it says that whatever I am, I made myself, and greater lie could not be told by anyone for any reason than to imagine that what you are is what you made yourself. It's an egoistic form of greed. It's like wanting to get all the credit for everything you are and scuttling that away into your own psyche and then proceeding in the world as if it were the truth of things. And so individualism is a real problem. To the extent that the United States has accomplished anything in history, it's in spite of individualism, not because of it. And so if you've got a bunch of people going around acting like they made themselves what they are, then you got a problem. And so individuality, on the other hand, is a great gift. Individuality is the gift that the community gives to the human individual. And individual means something undivided. It does not necessarily mean indivisible in principle. Undivided as a process for a time, localization of energies that will eventually dissipate and disappear into the past. But while they are undivided, in other words, individual, they take on a character that enables the accumulation of other characteristics that belong to that character. And these things are intensifications of unique position on the whole cosmos. Nobody sees the cosmos the way you do. Nobody sees it the way I do. And that's because nobody has ever been in this temporal situation before. And so therefore, what my opportunities are, and I would go further to say possibilities, which is way beyond opportunity, what my possibilities are and the way that those are exemplified in what I do, that's individuality. And it's a great gift, and it enables us to use the creation of a unique combination of energies to give back to that which surrounds us. And everything you do, Hartshorne called it contributionism. Everything you do contributes to every actual future that will come to be, because you can't undo it. It's irrevocable. Whatever you do can't be undone, and whatever value is in it is available for whatever comes after it. You can't
Sounds
make
like karma.
It does sound like karma. And in fact, Hartshorne admits that it sounds like karma.
Well, thank you for that, Randy. And I think that the audience has been just properly schooled in the matter. That was excellently presented, Randy. I just have one final question, and it's based on the fact that I've noticed through my time knowing you that you have a tendency to study scholars whose works have merit but who could not gain significant traction in academia. And I would think of characters such as Vico, Bachofen, Langer, and your recent work with Gary Herstein. And not to seem presumptuous, I would count myself in that area as well. I wonder if there's a leading source of satisfaction among the following three ideas that you are thinking of the sense of discovery in working with them, that you've done right by them, or that scholarship has scored a plus because you've done something with them. Is there one of those three that stands out in particular for you?
They're all three important. I would say that the reason that I go back and dig up things that other people paid little attention to, and I do the same thing with people, is because I feel very much constricted by what you might call the game that is academia. I have never been interested in playing that game. I have never been overly impressed with the academic game. And I do not think that philosophy benefits from having a professional discipline associated with it. I think academia, if anything, discourages original thinking. It punishes people who refuse to conform to whatever the most popular theories and methods are, and it spits them out. And it always has ever since academia of the sort that we understand it to be came into existence, which is really the late 18th century. But you would find the same thing in, for example, the schools of Paris in the Middle Ages. You would find that conformity is what they valued. And the same thing would happen with, for example, the rise of the Italian universities in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. They become these profoundly conservative institutions whose sort of self-maintenance involves rejecting new ideas. And so even though we can point to many people who came from academic institutional settings who end up being our heroes, more of the people who made the huge difference in, sort of the history of not just philosophy, but of science and of art, are people who had to find their own way outside of these institutions because the institutions were not exactly waiting with open arms to be transformed by the new ideas of a Leonardo or a Galileo or a Einstein or something like that. These people didn't fit in academia until after they had gained recognition. Spinoza is a good example of this because he was discouraged and hated by everybody until he became famous. Then they offered him an endowed chair. Actually, this happened more than once in his life, and he said, "Well, where were you when I was?" And just turned it down and kept grinding lenses. He'd rather make his own living his own way rather than be held to the expectations of an academic setting. So people like you, Charlie, and Gary Herstein, and many, many other people that I have known, you have better ideas than anybody who's around me in this repetitive thing they call the academy. And why wouldn't I prefer to have my primary interactions with people who have really great ideas as opposed to just listening to my colleagues repeat what they learned from their professors. This, by the way, has not made me particularly popular among my colleagues because they all know what I think of them. And what I think of them is they're lazy, they're entitled, they have a tendency just to do the bare minimum necessary to pull down what in the United States at least is a pretty nice paycheck for not very much work. And I don't have any respect for that. Most of them don't pay much attention to their teaching either. And so, they get themselves well ensconced by publishing, 3, 4 articles or something, and then they just coast the rest of the way. And to me, that's not what these institutions are for. We have this incredibly rare opportunity riding the crest of a high tide of civilization, and it's possible now for people like me to get paid doing philosophy, which that's not it's not something that happens a lot in human history, and yet these people are wasting that instead of appreciating it. And part of the way they waste it is by throwing out anybody who doesn't agree with them.
It sounds like you're almost discussing politicians as well.
Well, I happen to have had a political career in addition to this, which has gone pretty much like my academic career, except that the academic career they haven't succeeded in throwing me out. Whereas the political career, I think I might be done with that. Uh, so anyway, but I mean, the reason I went into it is to say the kinds of things I just said, but I would say it about them instead of about my academic colleagues. I'm not I'm not a very happy person when it comes to the state of the world. And I don't mind letting people know that. On the other hand, I would like to be thought of as a kind and generous person who just has some sharp words for those who don't hold up their end of the civilization bargain.
I've got a question. I keep encountering people online who seem to be talking philosophy, but the term they use for it is sense making. Are you aware of this sense making thing, and how does that relate to philosophy?
Well, it doesn't have anything to do with academic philosophy because when they talk about sense making, they're talking about very narrow theories of language. Yeah, I would say that. So look, everybody has philosophical moments, and most people have a lot of them, but they don't necessarily credit those moments because they haven't been encouraged to think of those moments as having some kind of value. And so one of the things you do as a philosophy teacher is you point out when that student is having a philosophical moment. You say that is good, um, but be aware it's also going to get you in trouble because people will say that that's not a serious idea or whatever. However, the sense making thing. I mean, I would say that everything I do is common sense. I refuse to look at any of it in any other way because I'm a radical empiricist. I don't believe in just giving people fancy abstractions that don't have any grounding in everyday experience. And so I would say this sense making thing is not a bad way to approach real philosophy. As opposed to academic philosophy, which I would suggest has never been real philosophy and is not likely to become so.
I sometimes think that people who present as speaking about philosophy do more to obfuscate than to reveal. Uh, do you agree with that?
Well, I've sat in a lot of coffee houses with what you might call the coffee house philosopher holding forth at the next table, if that's what you mean. That's a person who wants attention and needs to have, the ego fed. And there are lots of ways to do that, but I mean, they say a little philosophy is a dangerous thing, but actually that's adapted from a little bit of study is a dangerous thing. And so, but in general, so I don't feel like I have any need to intervene when the coffee house philosopher is holding forth. Furthermore, I can sometimes be quite delighted because some of it's good, right? Um, the sort of fawning, I don't know, wannabes that surround such a person impress me less than the person. That person is probably following a genuine spark of both understanding and intellect, and maybe also imagination, but just possibly hasn't been given the opportunity to make a serious study of it. For example, maybe discovered later in life when it's you can't go back to college or something, that this stuff holds some interest and got really serious. And people like that, they form all kinds of study groups. They form, Jung has a bunch of followers who don't hold forth in coffee houses, but they do like to get together and have wine and talk about Jung, and I think that's fine. So I mean, I think it's better than not having the conversations at all. How far it's going to take them, I don't know, because if you have to stay at it for years and years with very serious self-discipline to really get anywhere with this, and then you're still not really going to get anywhere with it because you're asking questions that don't have answers.
It
You can
sort of
ask.
reminds me.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say it. So I'm what I would call maybe Buddhist adjacent. I'm kind of a Buddhist, and I do meditation and that sort of thing. And there's, this talk about how you do it for years and years and years, but you have to do it without any thought that you're going somewhere. It's like if you have a goal, the goal seems to be an impediment, really.
I agree with you. That's part of the reason I'm a process philosopher. I have serious sympathies with Buddhism, and even more so with I Ching and Taoism. It's the journey, it's not the destination. And if you think you know the destination, you might want to rethink that. So, I
Yeah.
mean, it's that's what process philosophy is about. It's just a sort of westernized version of it. The Asian continent knew process philosophy thousands of years before the West discovered it.
So we've reached the end of the hour, and I think that's a good place to conclude and wrap. And I want to thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. And this has just really been fascinating.
Thank you.
Well,
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks.
Makes-
Thanks for putting us on.
Makes me want to practice philosophy. Just practice, not actually do it, but just practice. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.